You might open your Bibles up to 1 Timothy chapter 5, and we'll look there in just a few moments. 1 Timothy 5. It's good to be back with you again this evening, and looking forward to continuing our study of marriage this evening. I want to really pick up and continue, in some ways, our thoughts about headship and about the role of the husband, which is primarily what we were talking about this morning. Really, in a sense, as you're talking about marriage, you're almost always talking about the role of the husband and the duties of a husband. As we talked about, that means ownership. It means responsibility for. And so whatever's going on in the home, no matter what aspect, we're going to be talking about the husband. Sometimes we break it down into, okay, here we're going to be dealing with the husbands, and here we're going to deal with the responsibility of the wives. We never really leave the responsibilities of the husbands, no matter what it is that we're talking about in the home, because it always is his. But I do want to give some particular focus this evening to husbands and then to wives, and talk about how those roles work together and support each other. And I want to begin by looking at the role of the husband in particular, and that with looking at the word husbandry. Now, maybe you've heard that word in a particular setting. If you went to Auburn University, maybe they still have some degrees in husbandry, or Mississippi State. But it's not a word we generally use in our usual discourse, right? In our everyday conversations, we don't talk much about husbandry anymore. And the meaning, if you just look up in a modern definition, it says the care, the cultivation, and the breeding of crops and animals, which might sound like I'm about to make some offensive comparisons, but I assure you they're going to be offensive, hopefully only to those who reject God's word. The word husbandry and husband do have the same root. I mean, obviously, they look like they do. And so if you take them back, the word husband does not originally mean somebody that's married. Rather, it means the one who is the head of a household. What it came to be was sort of a position in a household. That is, the person who was responsible for the care of the household, the grounds, the animals, everything, sort of an estate. The person who is over the watching and the management of that estate was the husbandman, right? And then somewhere along the way, as you have that head of household, the person who's responsible for the estate, that came to be applied to what we would call the husband. Now, what's interesting is the word husband in its modern context has almost lost that entirely. Head over anything, right? Responsible for anything. It just is the male part of the marriage relationship. And yet the word inherently carries with it a responsibility for the whole. When we think about that in terms of what a husband's role is, over in Ephesians chapter 5 that we read a couple of times this morning, one of the things that it says is it's making those comparisons, and it's talking about the husband's responsibility to love the wife is to love her as his own body, and it talks about what he would do for his own body. And one of the things it says he does is he nourishes and cherishes it. Nourishing and cherishing, that is a key role for the husband. That idea of nourishing, especially, to feed in order to bring up to maturity. And I think about this in tying it in with some things we said about last week and cultivating love, like a garden. That a man has a garden, and it's a diverse and very busy garden that he has engaged in. And then when the more elements that get added to that with children and so forth, the more complicated it gets. And it involves a lot of activity. It involves a lot of nourishing. It involves a lot of weeding. And it's a daily task. And it doesn't take much for it to get overrun. And so we do need to take particular care about that nourishing and cherishing. So we've got the feeding aspect. The cherishing, that is a word that in its literal sense means to keep warm. And again, I think there are some non-literal ways in which the husband needs to keep the home warm for those who are in it, to keep it a place of comfort and care. And that's his role, to nourish and cherish his wife, to nourish and cherish that home environment. Now, there's ways, there's responsibilities for the husband to do this in literal terms. So over in 1 Timothy chapter 5 and in verse 8, 1 Timothy chapter 5 and in verse 8, but if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, his own household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever or a defiled person, some translations might say. Over in Exodus chapter 21, we see God again just including this as an element of the law, sort of in passing, that a husband would take care, that when he takes on a family, he takes that responsibility. And here we're talking about taking on multiple wives, right? Taking that responsibility on in ways that, in fact, we talked about this morning, are not particularly helpful, and yet you've taken that responsibility. So God requires in Exodus chapter 21 and verse 10, if he takes to himself another woman, he may not reduce her food, her clothing, or her conjugal rights. If he will not do these three things for her, then she shall go out for nothing without payment of money. That is that if he's going to take her on, this is his responsibility. These are the roles that he must fulfill as her husband. And so he can't play favorites, in other words. He must provide in appropriate amounts for every woman that he makes that commitment to. And of course, the Bible, or the New Testament in 1 Timothy chapter 5, Paul speaks about it in sort of obvious terms. You don't do this. Like, even the world knows you're a louse. Even the world knows you're a rotten person if you don't take care of your own family. And notice particularly, it is to the man, right? He's not saying that would be the same way the world would feel about a woman. And in many ways, that's still the case today. For the most part, we still have that sense in our society that when a man is not providing for the family, there is censure. There's social censure to that. You know, that deadbeat dad. We don't have that same term. We don't say deadbeat mom. Now, there's ways in which a mom can be a deadbeat, but it's generally not that she's not bringing home a paycheck. Maybe she's not fulfilling her role in other ways, but usually, still, even now in our society, we understand, if we're being honest, that role is still in the court of the man. Well, aside from that primary physical responsibility, and it is his responsibility, obviously there are other ways in which the home needs to be nourished and cherished, that it needs to be built up. And as we think about that from the standpoint of gardening, when you engage in that, if you begin to keep a yard and keep a garden and keep an outside grounds about your house in any sort of degree other than just cutting your grass when the weeds get too high, it involves a lot of effort. And the people that really are engaged in that, what you see is they come home from work, and maybe it's not been a great day at work, but look, the weeds aren't going to keep. And so they get home and they put on their work boots. There's not much daylight left, and so they got to get outside in a hurry and get done while the day is still there. And they put the time in, they read up on that and make sure that they're understanding what kinds of plants they're wanting to grow, what kind of food is going to be helpful for that. They understand, they learn about how to weed that and how to leave room between the plants and so forth. And you put all of that effort in because there's something at the end of the day that you want. There's a product that you're looking for. And people are willing to put all that effort in. I think about our homes and the way that men, a lot of times, sort of what their posture is towards the home is a lot like my posture to a garden, which is, as long as I can see plants growing, then I'll just let the weeds go. As long as I feel like the plants that I want are slightly taller than the plants that I don't want, we're all good. And so I don't make that tremendous effort. And I don't make that effort until maybe it looks like there's an emergency and I'm going to lose the crop. And I'm afraid a lot of husbands come to their homes like that. They just stay out of the way, let nature take its course. And if things get really out of hand, I'll step in. Otherwise, I'm going to be watching ESPN. I'm over here doing my own thing, paying attention. And if things just begin to look like it's going to be a disaster, why then Dad will step in and he will finally lay the law down. He'll do something, but not until then. It is not enough to simply stay out of the way. As we talked about this morning, that is abdication. Weeds, for most people, are just a part of gardening. But in the case of a family, they're a part of weak and sickly gardens. And when we leave that task undone, the world is actively cultivating what they want to see in our garden. And we have to be every bit as active at rooting it out night and day. So you come home from work and you say, I've had a long day at work and I just want to sit down and I want to tune out. I don't want to have to be engaged. Then don't go start a garden. You don't want to be engaged and you don't want to have to work when you come home from work. Stay by yourself. Because when you take on the task of a family, what you're saying is, I'm taking on an estate. And now I've got grounds to keep. And I've got things that need to be watered and planted and weeded. And it's every single day. I think mothers know this. Mothers who are generally left to and have a more of a responsible sense of picking up the slack because fathers don't, because fathers do go veg out. Mothers know there are no days off. We know in our house that when we start dropping like flies, when we're all getting sick, when we had COVID, it was fine for everybody to have COVID, but not Amy. Because the house will keep running if all of us are down. But it should be that my involvement is missed as much as hers. And that if I am out of the picture, what it should be is that I realize that my lack of involvement is already as missed as her lack of involvement. It's just maybe hers is more noticeable, more tangible on the surface. Maybe the husband's lack of involvement is more noticeable beneath the surface. But soon enough, it will be at the surface. Soon enough, the crop failure will be evident to all. So, we've got to come home. We've got to put on our work boots. And we've got to go to work, nourishing and cherishing and building up our garden. Our behavior is what makes the rest of the home's behavior easier and more possible. It opens up the path for everyone else to fulfill their responsibilities. Over in Ephesians chapter 5, as we look again at that comparison of Christ and the church, Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 27, Paul says that he might present to himself the church in all her glory, having no spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she would be holy and blameless. Every once in a while in sermons and books on marriage, as the attention turns to the wife, there will be some element of an instruction of responsibility for the wife to keep herself up, right? So that she needs to keep herself beautiful for her husband. Here, it says Christ is the one who makes her beautiful. And in so many different cases, when a wife becomes less beautiful, it is the husband who is putting the weight on her that is contributing to the bitterness and the frustrations, depression, and all of those sorts of things that do lead to less beauty. And I don't just mean on the outside, though it does, what is on the inside does come out on the outside. And so I think we spend too much time on the external and saying, make sure you keep yourself up, make sure you make sure you keep up your form and your appearance and so forth. Make sure you continue to attract him. This picture right here has nothing to do with the church making sure it attracts Jesus. But that Jesus' work, part of his work, is making us more attractive. By his efforts, by his example. And when we follow him, the whole picture gets more beautiful. And so I want to be very careful about that shallow sort of language that places on a woman a burden that really, I think, belongs, like so many others, more in the case of the husband. Along those lines, the husband needs to be the spiritual guide to his home. And he needs to take that responsibility for the spiritual growth of everyone in the home, including his wife. Again, Ephesians chapter 5, backing up to verse 26, so that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word. Again, that he might present to himself the church in all her glory, having no spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she would be holy and blameless. Now, somebody might say, well, look, but you're not Christ. Don't I know it? And yet, while I know I'm not Christ, there is Paul saying, you better act like him. And you better take on that role in your home. And you better lead your family to the promised land. In 1 Corinthians chapter 14 and verse 35, it gets rather explicit in these terms. Not only does Paul instruct that women are to keep silent in the assemblies, but he says if she has questions, let her ask her husband at home. Husbands, we must be capable of instructing. Now, what does that mean? We've got to be good Bible students. We need to be able to be teachers to everybody that's in our house. Now, somebody might say, what if the wife's smarter than you? Well, I know I fall in that category. And that makes it harder for her. Because she has to be a student to somebody who is her mental inferior. But that's what she chose. And she's got to live with that. And I will say that in some instances, in a great many instances, this is why it's so important, because I see women choosing on the basis of someone that they think is cute, someone that makes me laugh. Well, they make you laugh when you're not depending on them. But then when you really need them, and you need them to step up, and you need them to lead, and you need them to show the path forward, it's not funny anymore. Now they're just a goof off who hasn't ever grown up. And we don't need any more of those. And so a lot of women, as we're preaching through something like this, I'm sorry, they come to the realization that they have put themselves in the charge of somebody who's not up to the task. I am dead set on making sure my girls understand what they are getting into. When they go before God and they say, I am putting my life in this man's hands, I will support that biblical teaching all the way. And if they come back to me and want me to do what he is supposed to do, I will point them right back in his direction. You picked him. Now he's your leader. And I have seen many young ladies walk away from good homes into bad ones and wish they could go back. But they can't, because we turn our backs on that home and we form a new one. And we don't get to have the safety and the comfort of that old home. This is our home now. And so choose wisely. I think of Abigail in this regard. What a position she was in. She had married a fool, a worthless man. I don't know if Nabal means worthless because his name was Nabal, or if his parents saw him when he came out and had a prescience about that. But she married a man who was by name worthless and by character. And when his worthlessness put the whole house in danger, there's Abigail in the horrible position of having to come before David and say, I am so sorry, my husband is a fool. Abigail was a beautiful woman, and she was intelligent, and she was far more intelligent than her husband, and it made for a wreck of a marriage. It should not be. It should be that husbands make themselves capable to be leaders of those who are in their home. Not because they have higher IQs, but because they put their shoulder to the task of becoming what they ought to be, becoming capable of saying, follow me. We talked about this in our Bible class in the 9th and 10th grade this morning. As we're talking about evangelism, we're talking about teaching other people. One of the things Paul was capable of doing is saying, along with everything that he was teaching, follow my example. Husbands, do you want your children to turn out like you? Do you want them to believe and practice and have the character you have? And if that is not the case, then you are going to be a poorer reflection of Christ than you ought to be. We're all poor reflections, but a poorer reflection than you have a right to be. We must, as husbands and as fathers, be able to say to our families, follow me, and not be scared when we say it. That's wise advice. Follow me. Along these lines, husbands must take a more active role in the instruction of the family as a whole, engaging with the family in instruction. Are you opening up your Bibles with your wife and with your children? Are you inviting those questions? Or are we falling into that egalitarian sense of everybody's got to find it on their own? We leave our wives, you're smart, you can figure it out. No, I'm supposed to be a part of that. I'm supposed to be there for the questions. So, that's part of the weeding. That's part of the nourishing. And it's the biggest part, in fact, of those things. Another element that I think gets left out a lot is that a husband should be a jealous husband. That just flies in the face of 99% of marriage advice columns and books. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and in verse 2, it says, for I am jealous for you with a godly jealousy. For I betrothed you to one husband, so that to Christ I might present you as a pure virgin. Jealous with a godly jealousy, Paul says. Over in Exodus chapter 34, which is a passage we turn to look at the graceful description of God as he calls himself these gracious words in verse 6 of Exodus chapter 34. But notice down in chapter 34 and verse 14, he says, for you shall not worship any other God, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. One of the characteristics of God that he says, this is my name, is jealous. That is a godly characteristic. Somebody says, yes, but it can go horribly wrong, as can every characteristic. What characteristic cannot go horribly wrong? But the notion that a husband ought to fiercely guard the purity of his marriage. That he is jealous for the singular, the monogamous nature of his marriage. And that jealousy should not just be to keep her away from temptation, but that same jealousy should involve keeping himself away from temptation. I have known a great many wives in conversation who wish their husbands would display some jealousy. It would let them know that he cared what they were doing. I think about this, all of this, the guidance, the leadership in terms of one of the old cliches about nice guys. Why is it that girls never go for the nice guys? You hear that from time to time. Well, they do sometimes. In fact, more often than we give credit. But why do they go for the rebel? Well, I think sometimes the reason they don't go for nice guys is we have enough pushovers. And a rebel, though he is not, though I will try to keep my daughters from that at all cost, I do understand that women who aren't being taught and who aren't sure exactly what it is they're looking for, they see something of strength. At least here's somebody who would stand up to somebody. Give me that over the spineless weakling who will just roll over anytime he comes up against a challenge. So, God demands that husbands stand up. They stand up for their homes. They stand up for their wives. They stand up for the purity of their marriages. They do so from a place of strength. Love is a strong characteristic. It is not a simply yielding and stepping out of the way characteristic. In fact, very often that is the opposite of love. So, strong husbands. Now, strong husbands who are nourishing, strong husbands who are cherishing, strong husbands who are coming in, and even when they begin those processes of nourishing and cherishing, and maybe at first because it's awkward, there's pushback, they have the strength to continue to push and say, I'm going to do this even though it's going to be awkward for all of us. Because this is not the way our culture talks to each other. It's not the way our society talks to each other. But here we're going to do this. I appreciate that about men whose relationships I want to emulate. I appreciate that. I know I've told you the story about Brother Waldron talking in the most, what could have been the most awkward fashion about his marriage to Miss Sandra after she was gone. And one of the things that he told us in a room full of people who were taking everything in lighthearted ways, in a serious moment, he stopped all the laughter and he said, do you know what I miss about marriage? I miss having someone to cherish. And the strength that it takes to say that in that moment. When I went to visit his house, he showed me a poem that Sandra had written. And he started to read it, and he started crying. He said, you read it. And I started to read it, I started crying, and it was beautiful and horribly awkward. But it showed me they were willing to talk in front of each other in ways that people don't talk in front of each other. We're always with the smart comments. We're always with the quick wit and the jokes. And we're never sincerely, as often as we need to be, sincere and nurturing to one another. We've taken on the banter of the world, and that becomes the vocabulary of our homes. And you don't learn that from Scripture. I'm not saying there's no room for banter, but there's got to be some room for serious building up of the estate, of the homes that we are husbandmen of. Well, what about the helpmeet? That language of helpmeet we talked about this morning, the positioning of the husband towards the work and the wife towards the husband. And where love is the driving characteristic, for the husband. Respect is the foundation of the wife's role. We see that in Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 33 as it sums up the instruction with regards to husbands and wives. He says one more thing about Christ and the church in verse 32, but then he says, nevertheless, back to husbands and wives, each individual among you is to love his own wife. That is to say, every man is to love his own wife, even as himself. And the wife must see to it that she respects her husband. And those are not the same thing. This goes back to this morning. We do not relate in the same ways. And so the prescription is not the same. You can't interchange things here and say, well, of course, she's supposed to love him as well. That's right. But on the whole, as you're going through and seeing the instruction given to wives, there is the occasion where older women are to teach younger women to love their husbands and their children. But by and large, what they're being told is respect your husband. That is the foundation. And it is also what supplies the need. So here is what God has created a woman that she needs from the husband, is that warmth, that cherishing. Here is the way he has made the man, that he needs this regard and this respect. It's what he craves. And so God says you give that to him. It is very easy to love without respect. We talked about that last week as we talked about affection. It's very easy to love the lovable buffoon that you've married. Oh, this guy, I love him. He's an idiot, but I love him. And that is pretty much the way that the world's been portraying husbands by and large for at least 40 years in television and movies. Here's this man. He's not an ogre, right? He's not a terrible person. He's just an idiot. We love him, but we don't listen to him. There was a time where even in television it was presented as, here's the man who has the answers. Here's the man who's going to set things right. Things get out of hand, but you go and dad comes home and now father really does know best. And there's a sense of comfort in that. But we've moved away from that, and it's easier also to say that you love without condition. Because it is easier to have affection for someone or something that does not have qualities that particularly draw our affection. It's less rational sometimes, our affection. Respect, we don't usually give respect where it's not earned. But God says, you give respect. And he says it in the same terms that he says to the husband, you give love. And so the respect is equally without conditions as the love is. This is the respect of treating him as that husbandman, or to put it a little bit more to the point, as the Lord of the manor. In 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 6, just as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, and you have become her children if you do what is right without being frightened by any fear. Have you heard a wife speak to her husband with that level of reverence? I almost think we would snigger. What would we do with that? Could we even take that person seriously? When's the last time you heard a wife speak in those sorts of tones to her husband? It is not cultural. It is very anti-cultural. And so there's a very serious reverence here that is not only utterly absent, but horrifying for our world to consider, for our culture to consider. Peter not only says that this should be the positioning of a wife before a husband, but he even says in verse 1, in the same way you wives be submissive to your own husbands, so that even if any of them are disobedient to the word. They may be won without a word by the behavior of their wives. It is not you go in and you tell him what's what. You let him have it and you don't let up till he changes. He actually says, don't say a word. That's not what he tells the husbands. But it is what he tells the wives. Wives. You go in and you have the submissive behavior. That will be more attractive. That will bring him closer to God than anything that will ever come out of your mouth in an instructive fashion. It's not your role. It's not the role God has given you. Again, we have egalitarian notions. We have notions that they're equal parts. And you say, so a wife can never be instructive to her husband. I'm not saying a wife can never be instructive to her husband. But she can never be the boss of her husband. She can't be the instructor of her husband. This is something Amy and I had to work through a little bit in our marriage, early on especially. She taught high school boys all day and then married a guy who wasn't that far out of high school. That is not a dig at anybody's age. It's just the reality. And so she would come home from school, and if you know many teachers, she still was talking like a teacher. And we just had to work through that. And I said, Amy, I know I look like one of your students, but I'm not. And I didn't say that very well or very helpfully. But over the course of time, we understood and we began to appreciate more the ways that we should approach each other and the ways that I could approach her with care and nurturing and cherishing, and the way that she could approach me with honor and respect. And it involves the tone of voice. It involves the way we approach from the standpoint of, is it instructive or is it asking a question? And it matters. And these are not advice columns God's writing here. And this is the way he says it should be. This is what Peter is saying. This is the pattern. This is what it looks like. This is what ought to be. So, respect is the foundation. The role of childbearing is hers, and it is her glory. Now, in obvious terms, she's the only one who can bear children. But it is a glorious aspect of the home for a woman to be a mother. There are all sorts of reasons why a woman might not end up being a mother in a home. But that does not take away from this truth. We talked about that in the last lesson about the family. The ideal picture of the home is indeed the man who is taking care of, heading the household, providing for the household, and a woman bearing and raising children in the home as well as managing the home, which we'll talk about in just a moment. And so when Paul says to Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 2 and in verse 15, this passage that talks about salvation even, he says the women will be preserved, or preservation rather. Women will be preserved through the bearing of children if they continue in faith and love and sanctity with self-restraint. Now, I think we all understand this is not the only way for a woman to be preserved is through childbearing. But as he's talking about men and women, and he's talking about roles of men and women, and he starts out talking about all the way back up in verse 8, the things that he has expectations of men for, and then he talks about expectations of women, and he talks about limitations of women. And so what does he do? He comes back in verse 15, he says, but look, there's a place where she has no equal. She stands alone. There's no corollary of what men can do here, but to be a mother. And indeed, the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world. Here she finds her greatest fulfillment and glory, just as the man can find his Christ-likeness in being the head of a home. Can he be Christ-like in other ways if he's not the head of a home? Yes. But there's a certain pinnacle of it that is found in that role. Well, there's a pinnacle here that's found in this role. And we need to talk about it that way. We need to build it up and hold it up that way. Just think how hard the world is trying, and Christians who are influenced by the world are trying to come away with thinking something else about the woman's role in the home than this. It so consistently speaks in these terms, and yet people walk away going, that's what's one option. It's not just one option. It's glory. And we need to talk about it like that. Her role is then also management of the home. In Titus chapter 2 and in verse 3, Titus 2 and verse 3, older women likewise are to be reverent in their behavior, not malicious gossips or enslaved too much to wine, teaching what is good, so that they may encourage the young women to love their husbands, to love their children, to be sensible, pure, workers at home, kind, being subject to their own husbands, so that the word of God will not be dishonored. So we have all of the elements that we've already talked about, and then this keeper of the home, this manager of the home. Well, what does that look like? Well, what I want to suggest to you is that her role is inside the home, and that is, again, a role that is postured towards him so that his role outside the home can flourish. When we look back over at Proverbs chapter 31, in Proverbs chapter 31, and in verse 23, her husband is known in the gates when he sits among the elders of the land. When you read through Proverbs chapter 31 and you see that the mother here of King Lemuel is describing this woman and all the characteristics, and among the characteristics of the woman is that her husband is known in the gates and he sits among the elders of the land. I almost think that we would look at that, if we're just thinking in modern terms, that we would look at like that would be a mocking picture. Here she is doing all of this activity. What's he doing? He is over there sitting down with a bunch of guys talking at the gates. Typical. What he's saying is he gets to have a place of importance and prominence and influence. Why? Because of what this woman's doing in the home. A man who has to constantly take away from that role to be at home to put out the fires that are always cropping up can't be in the gates making decisions and ruling well. He's got to go take up that slack. But here's a man, as it tells us from the beginning, he trusts. And so because of her focus here, he is able to flourish out there. And that needs to be the posture of whatever a woman is engaged in. I think it's similar to the talk in Acts chapter 6, where we have this situation comes up and it comes before the apostles. And what are we going to do? Well, we're going to appoint some men. I want you to select 7 men, and here are the qualities of those men. And one of the things it says, so that we do not have to serve at tables. Now, I don't think what they mean is, we're just too good for that. It's that they have other roles. And this would take away from that. And there are other people who can take up that role and leave these men to do this role, which is what they are particularly suited for. So, it's not do these menial tasks, but it is do these necessary tasks. And I think that in those tasks, God has created women in general, with a better capacity and a better skill set inherent, and that men have a better skill set to do the work that He's called them to do. And when she is functioning in all the ways she ought to be functioning, it makes him more capable to function in all the ways that he ought to be functioning. I do not believe that this excludes a role outside of the home, but I do think that it guides the motives of work outside the home. So back in verse 11 of Proverbs chapter 31, beginning verse 10, an excellent wife who can find, for her worth is far above jewels. The heart of her husband trusts in her, and he will have no lack of gain. She does him good and not evil all the days of her life. The very context, right, as we get into the description of the woman, what's the point? She provides for the value of his home. She increases the value. She does good for his home and not harm. And so her path is not independent of providing help for him. That's back to help me. That's what her goal is. That's what her objective is. So when we're talking, when I'm talking to my daughters about career paths, I talk to my daughters about marriage. You intend to get married? Yes, we do intend to get married. I don't tell them they have to, because again, you don't have to get married. Do you intend to get married? Yes, we do. All right. So what are you going to do? What are you thinking as far as career paths? So we talk about that. All right. Well, what will happen when you get married? Well, I intend to have kids and raise those children at home. Okay, good. Then what happens to that career path that you just took on? Well, I have to set it down. All right. So we're going to spend $50,000, $60,000 for the next 4 years for something that you very likely may set right back down. Does that sound wise? Well, no, that doesn't sound very wise. All right, is there a career path that if you don't get married, because there are no guarantees there, that you could be successful at, and yet if you need to walk away immediately from that career path, that you can still use that skill set in bringing it into the home in this way? What's some ideas there? What I think and what I'm afraid of is we've taken the world's message into teaching our daughters about career paths, and we use language that is not a whit's different than teaching our sons about career paths. And it ought to be different, because they don't have the same goals. They don't have the same responsibilities. They don't have the same roles. And we take up that mantra. You can do anything you want to do, anything you set your mind to, and you can still be a mom, and you can still be a keeper at home, and there'll be no difference, and it's just not true. You don't get to be all the things. Your career path is not going to look like his because you don't have the same job he has. And I'll tell you, one of the great ironies about all of this is that even though women have been told for years and years and years that the home is a waste, it's a waste of their resources, it's a waste of their minds, and they need to get out there in the workplace, and then they do, and they buy into the notion that they can be all the things and have all the things, and then they get out there, and lo and behold, the world cannot keep them from continuing to make those same old choices of having children, and worse yet, going home to raise them. And you know what one of the results is? Is that women in the workplace end up making less in the same fields than men because of those very choices. Now, I'm not going to get into all the statistics, but let me just tell you right now, the wage gap between men and women can be utterly explained by the very choices that God said, I put there. And the world is trying to legislate it out of existence like they want to legislate out the law of gravity or something. And God says it's still there. You beat your head against it for 3 generations, and you just can't convince the women yet to completely give it up. God willing, they never will be able to. Well, in all of this, a woman can be supportive of that role of the man by taking on that willingness to come to him and be a follower of him. And in many ways, a disciple of her husband. That's what it is, a student, a follower, a learner. I think that's what Paul is laying out in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, that you go home and you ask him. He is your teacher. He's your instructor, that intimate instructor. He learns here in the public place, and then he brings that knowledge home, and he teaches it there in the home. Too many wives, they do not trust their husbands to take on this role, and therefore they do not support that role. But what's worse is too many husbands don't provide them anything to submit to. Don't provide them anything to learn from. Turn them away when they do bring questions. Have no answers when they have questions. All of these things should not be. Here is the picture. Here's what ought to be. Here's what it should look like. As I said this morning, culture, it's never going to be a complete God. But it's no God right now. There's just nothing. You cannot turn on, you cannot find, it seems, a representation, not in any nook or cranny that I look in, can you find a representation of a family where people present the roles that even resemble what God is talking about here. Again, it would be mocked to oblivion. And so, we need not only actively take up, we need to not only just fight back against maybe the most aggressive assaults against the home. If we want to destroy the home, it's not just, it wouldn't just take us becoming full-on supporters of the worldly feminism. All we need to do is just sit back and let nature take its course. Let the weeds take over. The world, as I said, is cultivating the garden that it wants to see. And if we would have godly homes, we are going to have to be aggressive cultivators in response. I hope that you will see pictures here that call for adjustments in your homes. And that husbands, you will take the lead. As I said at the beginning, as we go down through and we look at those roles of the wives, don't think that we stopped talking about the husbands when we did that. You are there to provide the path for her to be that. But I do want to say to women, you can make that job easier. And you can make it harder. If you're here this evening and you're not a Christian, some people may look at this and think that this is an unattractive picture. Can I suggest to you that the only reason you think that is because you've been sold a bill of goods? That when a home operates as God pictures it operating, there is no better place to be. No more comforting, no more joyous, no more nourishing and cherishing place to be than that home. And if you think, well, I don't know if that would work out. You think the world's got a better option? I don't say this as a prude who's trying to shake my fist at people having all the fun out there. No, I'm shaking my fist at the destruction that's going on out there. And so what I hope you would see is an appealing thing that says, oh, what a relief it would be to find a place where there's a real leader who says, I'm following Jesus, you come follow me. But indeed, if you're not in that kind of home, you can pick up that banner and you can follow Jesus on your very own. And you could find a family here who would support you in that. Mothers and fathers that maybe you did not have, and sisters and brothers. And we would encourage you in that in every way that we possibly could. If we can help you make that commitment this evening, won't you come while we stand and while we sing?